Channel's Week in Review. The Palestinian push at the United Nations, a new book about Broadway hits stores, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. While many were away from the news during the new year, a drama was playing out at the United Nations Security Council, where the Palestinian Authority submitted a bid for recognition as a state and lost by a narrow margin. 8 nations voted for the Palestinian statehood resolution, and only 2 voted against it, with 7 abstentions. The measure lost by a single vote. Only Australia and the United States voted against the measure, while those voting for it included France, and those abstaining included the United Kingdom. Interestingly, the resolution was more likely to fail when it was submitted, just before the new year, than it would be today. Several seats in the Security Council are changing hands with the new year, and a statehood resolution could well have the 9 votes it would need to pass now that this has happened. Of course, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas knew this before he submitted the resolution for a vote at the end of December, and so this can be seen as more of a diplomatic display, showing a measure while being nearly assured it will fail, instead of giving it a likelier shot of success just a week or 2 later. It's all part of the dance done around international recognition of Palestine, as Abbas simultaneously seeks more recognition to pressure Western powers in Israel, while at the same time avoiding the crossing of certain diplomatic points of no return. But once again, this vote does show how thoroughly isolated is the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the world stage, as votes continue to go heavily in favor of policies the Netanyahu government opposes. Similarly isolated is the United States, which continues to vote for the Netanyahu government's policies at the UN, but the U.S. can no longer count Western stalwarts like the UK, France, and Germany among those who will provide diplomatic cover for those votes. Moving on, Meredith Gansman speaks with author Jennifer Tepper about her book on Broadway in a segment from our theater program, Row J.
8 times a week, theatergoers take their seat at a Broadway show. And while they may be excited to see a starring actor or iconic composer, the theaters, like the Gershwin, are characters in the production as well, and their untold stories are about to be told. Back when theater historian and 54 Below programming director Jennifer Ashley Tepper worked on the Broadway musical Title of Show, she found herself exploring backstage at the Lyceum Theater.
And there were all of these dressing rooms not in use that were filled with like mysterious boxes of things. There's like a huge penthouse where the Schubert archives are above the theater. There's like an old-fashioned smoking lounge underneath the house. There's just a lot to explore, and it made me realize, oh, these theaters are all really different, and how the theaters are themselves contribute to the experiences people are having in them as they do shows there.
These explorations and many more through now 16 Broadway theaters have been cataloged in the Untold Stories of Broadway, tales from the world's most famous theaters. Tepper has interviewed everyone from actors and producers to those theater professionals not listed in your playbill.
Yeah, I was not surprised, but just excited to share the stories of doormen and house managers and people who, don't get interviewed as often, who are equally as passionate about the theater.
One theater profiled in the newly released 2nd volume of Tepper's book is the Gershwin, currently home to the long-running show Wicked. Next door is the Circle in the Square Theater, which houses the river. But the theaters aren't connected. In 2012, Godspell played the Circle in the Square Theater. Both Wicked and Godspell have music written by Stephen Schwartz.
So when Stephen Schwartz was working on Godspell and Wicked was here, was he running just back and forth and back and forth?
I think sometimes,
Walking briskly.
I've heard stories about, going to see part of one show and part of the other.
Schwartz is part of the very large Jewish presence in theater history and culture, including the Schuberts, who emigrated from the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century and built one of the biggest empires on Broadway. These are just a couple of the many Jewish personalities in Tepper's book.
I thought of one earlier of Randy Graff talking about going to see Seesaw at the Gershwin when she was a kid, and her thinking, oh, this is the first time I've ever seen like a Jewish girl from the Bronx on stage, the character from Seesaw, and her thinking, oh, I'm a Jewish girl from the Bronx and I can be on Broadway. And those stories in the book are always like really moving to me.
To learn more about Jennifer Tepper and the Untold Stories of Broadway Volumes 1 and 2, tune into the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, this week on Up Close, the idea that a nation has an original sin that animates much of its character is a common concept. In this week's episode, we'll look at how the United States hoped to avoid corruption with its very founding documents, and one scholar's thesis suggesting that modern Turkey's original sin serves as an excuse for authoritarianism today. Zephyr Teachout is known to many as a recent candidate for the Democratic nomination for governor of New York, but she is also a law professor at Fordham University. We discuss her book, Corruption in America, From Benjamin Franklin's Snuffbox to Citizens United. And then, Fatma Muga Göçek grew up in Turkey, a Muslim believing that there had been no such thing as an Armenian genocide. Her work since then has endeavored to shine a light not only on that truth, but on what failing to recognize that truth does to Turkey. Her book is Denial of Violence, Ottoman Past, Turkish Present, and Collective Violence Against the Armenians, 1789 to 2009. Here are some of the highlights from my interview with Zephyr Teachout. So my curiosity is piqued. What is Benjamin Franklin's Snuffbox?
When Franklin was ending his diplomatic tour of France, he'd been there for many years and really well loved by the French. He was given a diamond-encrusted snuff box with a portrait of the King of France on it from the king. And there was some outrage and concern that this was going to corrupt Benjamin Franklin, that he would then take French economic interests too warmly in the future. Right. And the reason I think it's so important is because it led to a provision in our Constitution that's still there that forbids taking a gift of any kind whatever from a foreign power without getting permission of Congress. So it shows something about how the framers of the Constitution and the early Americans were really fussy about corruption.
The psychology or the philosophy of it, I think, is a fascinating thing, because corruption is not like stealing. It's not like murder, because you can say, oh, well, that is theft because you took something from someone. That is murder because you did something. But you didn't corrupt something. You can't corrupt an object. You can't just simply, you can't say, oh, I corrupted today.
For the first really 120 years, there was no criminal law to speak of that prosecuted people for bribery. But one of the provisions of most criminal bribery statutes is that a thing of value is given to someone in a position of authority with intent to influence their behavior. And there's often a provision that says corruptly. So then juries have to decide, well, were those cookies given to that judge corruptly? Right. What does corruptly mean? And so it's actually, to your point, it's a really hard fit with criminal law in that way, because it's hard to figure out when something is done corruptly and when it's not.
Right, so how has that been decided at different times over the course of American history?
Not early on, really up until 1976, courts saw one of their jobs as protecting against temptation. Protecting against different influences. Lobbying was against the law for about 100 years in our history, and courts would refuse to enforce contracts to lobby. If you and I made a lobbying contract, you successfully go and persuade Albany to pass the law I want, and then come back and ask for your pay. I'd say, no, I'm not going to pay you, and the court would agree with me that it's sort of like a contract for prostitution. It's so outside of the realm of, it's so corrupting that they wouldn't enforce them. And then for the first, really until the 70s, bribery statutes, the juries were just given extraordinary leeway to decide what was corrupt and what wasn't. And then that's been narrowing a lot in the last 30, 40 years.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast, available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLink Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.